The Whisky War, the most peaceful territorial dispute in the world. In the icy winds of the Arctic Ocean, between Greenland and Canada in the middle of the Kennedy Channel, lies a small uninhabited island called Hans Island. This barren rocky island, less than 1.3 kilometers long and 1 kilometer wide, has no trees and is rarely visited by even polar bears. Yet this seemingly insignificant island became the center of an international war. For 49 years, from 1973 to 2022, however, not a single drop of blood was shed in this war. Chapter 1: The Beginning of War. In 1973, Canada and Denmark, the sovereign nation of Greenland, signed a treaty establishing their maritime boundaries. Most of the border was agreed upon smoothly. But there was a problem in exactly one place, Hans Island. "This island is closer to our territory," insisted the Canadian negotiator. "No, geographically it's closer to Greenland, isn't it?" The Danish side countered. In reality, Hans Island was located almost exactly the same distance from both nations' coastlines. Unable to find a solution at the negotiating table, both countries decided to leave this small island as an unresolved area. And so Hans Island was forgotten, or so it seemed. Chapter 2: The First Flag. On a sunny day in July 1984, Tom Høyem, Denmark's minister for Greenland, landed on Hans Island by helicopter. He planted a Danish flag at the island's highest point. Then, with a meaningful smile, he placed something beneath the flag. It was a bottle of Danish schnapps, and a note that read, "Welcome to Danish Hans Island." When this news reached Canada, Canadians were outraged. "They're invading our Arctic territory." However, the Canadian government's response was remarkably calm. A few weeks later, Canadian soldiers arrived at Hans Island. They carefully took down the Danish flag and erected a Canadian flag in its place. Then, next to the schnapps bottle the Danes had left, they placed a bottle of Canadian whiskey. The note read, "Welcome to Canada." Thus began the most peaceful war in the world. Chapter 3: The Golden Age of the Whisky War. From the mid-1980s through the 2000s, Hans Island became a regular visiting spot for soldiers from both nations. Whenever the Danish Navy passed by Hans Island during patrols, they would invariably stop to take down the Canadian flag and raise the Danish flag. Then they would place schnapps or aquavit next to the whiskey bottles left by their predecessors. Sometimes they included joking notes like, "Canadian friends, our liquor tastes better." The Canadian military wasn't about to back down. During Arctic training or whenever they passed nearby, they would stop at Hans Island to take down the Danish flag and raise the maple leaf Canadian flag. They left the Danish liquor untouched while adding Canadian whiskey or maple syrup. "Brothers, try some maple syrup." This unique territorial dispute soon caught the attention of media in both countries. Denmark-Canada fight over territory with alcohol. The world's friendliest war. The Whisky War, a 49-year dispute with 0 casualties. Chapter 4: Public Reaction. Interestingly, citizens of both nations took this war seriously. While also enjoying it humorously, a bar in Canada held an event, Hans Island Recapture Celebration Special, Canadian Whiskey. Half price! Customers alternated between Danish beer and Canadian whiskey, while celebrating their peaceful victory. In Denmark, a Copenhagen newspaper published a joke article titled, "Recruiting. Hans Island Expedition Team. Requirements can withstand the cold. Bring good liquor and get along well with Canadians." Some Canadians and Danes even called each other honorable enemies on online forums, exchanging jokes. "Next time I'll bring better whiskey. You'll have to admit our schnapps is superior." Chapter 5: Diplomatic Tension. Of course, not everything was always pleasant. In 2005, Canada's Defence Minister Bill Graham personally visited Hans Island. This prompted an official protest from the Danish government. "A cabinet-level visit has crossed the line." The Danish Foreign Ministry issued a statement. Canada responded politely, "We were simply visiting our territory." However, even this tension didn't damage the long-standing friendly relations between the two countries. The two nations were NATO allies, and there was deep respect and intimacy between their citizens. In fact, when discussing this issue at the negotiating table, diplomats from both countries would often burst into laughter. "Are we really fighting over this little rock?" said a Canadian diplomat. "Yes, but at least we're fighting with alcohol, aren't we?" replied the Danish diplomat with a smile. Chapter 6: A New Era. In the late 2000s, as the strategic importance of the Arctic Ocean increased, the Hans Island issue took on new meaning. with climate change opening Arctic shipping routes, and the potential for underground resources gaining attention, international interest in Arctic territories grew. However, Canada and Denmark made a different choice. Instead of escalating the conflict, they returned to the negotiating table. In 2012, both countries began negotiations to demarcate maritime boundaries in the Lincoln Sea, including the Hans Island issue. The negotiations proceeded slowly but amicably. Meanwhile, the Whisky War continued. In 2016, Canadian soldiers built an igloo on Hans Island and stored whiskey inside. Danish soldiers discovered the igloo and, laughing, planted a Danish flag and added schnapps bottles. Chapter 7, A Peaceful Conclusion. On June 14, 2022, a historic moment finally arrived. Canadian Foreign Minister Melanie Joly and Danish Foreign Minister Jeppe Kofod met in Ottawa to sign an official agreement. The two countries agreed to divide Hans Island exactly in half. Hans Island became the only Arctic island where the border between Canada and Denmark-Greenland passes through. At the signing ceremony, Minister Joly said, "This is the Canadian way of resolving international disputes. Dialogue, compromise, and a bit of humor." Minister Kofod replied with a smile, "We fought for 49 years by exchanging liquor. Now it's time to drink together." Indeed, at the reception following the signing ceremony, both Canadian whiskey and Danish schnapps were served together. Epilogue. The Whisky War of Hans Island remains a rare case in modern international relations. What makes this story special is the creativity, humor, and, above all, the respect for each other that both countries showed in resolving their territorial dispute. Today, a small sign marking the border between the two countries stands on Hans Island, and according to legend, near the sign, whiskey and schnapps bottles still sit side by side. This small uninhabited island has become a symbol of peaceful dispute resolution. When the world is filled with conflict, Hans Island asks us, why wage war? Why not have a drink and talk instead? The Whisky War has ended, but its spirit will continue. Canada and Denmark remain friends, and Hans Island has become not a divider, but a bridge connecting the two nations. Perhaps this is the true victory. Historical fact: this story is based on the actual Hans Island territorial dispute between Canada and Denmark-Greenland. In June 2022, both countries reached a historic agreement to end their 49-year peaceful Whisky War by dividing the island in half.